Hello Chem 1A, this is Chapter 2, Lecture Video 3, and we're going to be talking about diatomic elements and ions in this video. Some elements are not naturally monoatomic, meaning if you find them in nature, you're going to find them attached to each other, usually themselves, in this scenario. Elements are known as diatomic. They're basically paired together. They're attached to each other. Two atoms of the same element are bonded to each other, and that's how you find them, not as individual units, but actually attached to each other, made up of molecules, not atoms. These elements are special, and we need to kind of memorize which ones are diatomic and which ones aren't. There are 7 diatomic elements, and they are hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. These are the 7 diatomic elements, and you need to have them memorized. Okay, let's talk about ions. Ions are atoms or groups of atoms with a positive or negative charge. So these things are charged. They're not necessarily positive or negative. They could be either if we just use the word ions. Removing an electron from an atom is always going to produce an ion with a positive charge. So how do we get charged particles? It's all about either gaining or losing electrons. And since electrons have a negative charge, when we lose an electron, the resulting ion is positive charged. We pronounce positively charged ions as cations, not cations, but cations are ions with a positive charge. Adding an electron to an atom is going to give an ion with a negative charge. So where cations are made by losing electrons, anions are made by gaining electrons. And we call an ion with a negative charge an anion, not an anion, but an anion. Okay, so again, just to kind of try to drive this home, cations are always going to be formed through the loss of electrons. So magnesium, generally when charged, is going to be 2+, and that is due to it losing 2 electrons. Whereas fluorine, when charged, generally has a -1 charge, and this is due to the F gaining an electron and becoming negatively charged. Now, certain elements have preferred charges they almost always adopt when they're charged. In general, you should know that metals never gain electrons. Metals are pretty much never going to have a negative charge. They're always going to be cations. Whereas nonmetals, there's a lot more fluctuation between them, but generally, nonmetals are typically going to form anions. One exception to this is hydrogen. Hydrogen usually has a +1 charge, making it mostly a cation, but it's one of the few nonmetals that actually forms a cation rather than an anion in its charged particle. Now, here is a list of the charges that I expect you to have memorized. So you need to know that the first column on the periodic table, all of these guys are +1 when they're charged, including hydrogen. So everything in the first group or first column of the periodic table always is going to adopt a +1 charge. Everything in the second column on the periodic table is going to adopt a 2+ charge. We're going to skip over these 3 for just a second. Everything in this third column that doesn't count the transition metals is going to adopt a 3+ charge, but primarily the only one we see that does that is aluminum. We're going to skip 4A entirely, don't worry about it. Column 5A, everything that's a nonmetal here is going to adopt a -3 charge, so basically just nitrogen and phosphorus. 6A, everything in this column is going to adopt a -2 charge, again, as long as it's a nonmetal or a metalloid. And then everything in this last column before the noble gases is going to adopt a -1 charge. Hydrogen is kind of weird. It sometimes is +1 and sometimes is -1, but the vast majority of the time it's not negative. This is very rare and it's not very stable when it has a negative charge, so we almost never see it with a negative charge. So let's not worry about it. Metal ions will lose as many electrons as they need to have the same number of electrons as the prior noble gas. This is another way of remembering these charges. Nonmetals, on the other hand, will gain as many electrons as they need to get the same number of electrons as the nearest noble gas ahead of them. So one of the things that I like to think about is I think about the periodic table as like a stereotypical high school movie, and everybody on the periodic table wants to be like the cool kids. Well, the cool kids are the noble gases in this case, right? This is helium. It has 2 electrons when it's neutral. This is neon. It has 10 electrons when it's neutral. Argon has 18. Krypton has, I think, 36. And so on. Well, if we look at oxygen, when it's neutral, it has 8 electrons. So how can it be like the nearest noble gas? Well, it can gain 2 so that it has 10. At the same time, sodium has 11 electrons when it's neutral. Well, it wants to be like its nearest pal, the same noble gas, neon, which means it needs to lose 1 electron, giving it a +1 charge, right? So this is one way to kind of remember the charges. At the end of the day, I don't really care how you memorize these. You do need to memorize them. Now, most of the transition metal block have what we call variable charges. That's why I've blacked them all out here, with the exception of 3 elements, and that is silver, cadmium, and zinc. These 3 elements are always these charges, so you just need to memorize them. There's no noble gas rule that applies to these very easily. We'll talk about why they're those charges later on in the class near the end. But at this point, you just need to memorize that silver always has a +1 charge, cadmium is always 2+, and so is zinc. All right, so if you have any questions, please let me know. As always, I'm happy to help.